All right, so let's talk about Joe Biden. Joe Biden apparently there was I think it came out of his campaign that they said something to the effect of like, we're just not worried about Hispanics or Latinos. The I guess the I don't know if that's the subtext of it, but the implication is that their strategy is less through the Southwest and more through the Midwestern industrial states. And so that's where their focus is. They're not worried about Arizona because they're going to win Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. I mean, I don't know. This is just what I've read. What's your take on this?
I haven't read that exact thing, but that would be a mistake, I think. I mean, I think especially now that it seems like Arizona really could be a possibility for not only Joe Biden and the reclaiming of the White House, but also in the Senate when the race between Mark Kelly and Martha McSally. And, you know, I think Latino voters, because they represent such an important part of the electorate there, are going to be really important to Arizona and to the Southwest as a whole. So I think that would be a mistake. I mean, I don't personally, I guess this is just my opinion in some way as an expert, as a historian, but not an expert as a political strategist today. I would say that it would be a mistake to exclusively focus on the Midwest as the territory that Democrats need to reclaim. I think there's a really important national fight to be had in the West, in the Southeast, and other places. So I think that it would be a mistake to kind of ignore Latino voters because, and other voters, I mean, all voters across the nation, because you think that the key battleground is going to be in the Midwest. I think, you know, part of why this is important too is that we don't, you know, Democrats shouldn't want a close election. You know, we shouldn't want it to be electorally close because that makes it possible for Trump to contest the election and other things. They should try to, I think, really wage a national campaign.
I couldn't agree more. I wonder if the theory is simply on some level, we're not going to convince. I mean, because it sort of sounds like, you know, if somebody can say, I'm supporting Donald Trump because the Republican Party, you know, I've invested, you know, it's basically sunk costs, right? I've invested so much into this project, the Republicans, that I can't let go of it now. I mean, I remember interviewing a delegate at the RNC in 2004. He was, I mean, like almost, it seemed to me, in the room in Madison Square Garden, somewhat, I don't want to say famous, but a celebrity, because he was, people pointed to him from from various states. I was looking for a gay Republican who could explain to me at a time where where George Bush was, you know, pushing for an amendment to prevent gay people from marrying. Like literally, they're like, I think there's somebody in California you could talk to. As I was holding up a sign, I went and I spoke to the guy, and I think he was probably in his mid 60s, and he almost started crying as I was talking to him about it. Like he said, you know, if I leave the party, I was asking him, I don't know how you can stay in a party that literally is trying to write you into the Constitution as second-class citizen. And he said, if I leave the party, who's here to reform it from the inside? And I'm like, yeah, I guess so. But maybe that's not the way that this is going to get reformed.
Right. Yeah, totally.
I mean,
totally.
How do you convince, let me put it this way. How do you convince somebody who's holding white-knuckled onto this part of their identity, right? That they're a Republican. We have invested all this money into, you know, or time or resources or energy or emotion into changing, you know, the Republican Party. And I am a Republican chair of my county, whatever it is, because, you know, like, how do you convince those people? Or do you just basically say, we got to write that off and look for our votes other places?
No, I think this is where also, you know, difference between national messaging from the president differs from what's happening on the ground in particular places. I mean, Latinos in Florida are being told by the RNC that they really matter to the party, even as Donald Trump is sending very mixed messages about how much they matter. The same thing happens in Puerto Rico, where you know, the party leaders of the Republican Party in Puerto Rico are, waging campaigns in all the states because they participate in primary elections, but they don't participate in the general election. So the way that they exert some measure of national influence is by literally getting on planes and going to Nebraska or Florida or New York and kind of lobbying for their issues at the state level when they don't think they're getting a warm national reception. So I think part of it has to do with the difference between national messaging and kind of statewide messaging. And, Trump, I think, is, as we've known all along, I mean, he's paying much more attention to how his base feels than how, the broader Republican coalition feels. But then that's where you have, I mean, the White House even today, I mean, they haven't given up on Latinos in any way. I mean, they have people who work in the Office of Public Liaison who still today are putting together, conference calls for Latino business owners to talk about how Donald Trump is the one who's really fighting for them to kind of get them through this difficult pandemic time. And Donald Trump, through the Small Business Administration, has done more for them than any other president in history. So I don't think they've given up on this electorate at all. I think they've, been hard pressed sometimes to defend some of the national leaders' statements, but I think that they would still try to convince Latinos that it's the Republican Party that is representing their interests. I mean, the RNC has been doing this for decades explicitly, where they've been paying workers to show up to Latino events across the country and talk about how it's the Republican Party that supports or that will, help them buy homes or help them raise their wages. Yeah, all of these kinds of things.
I imagine Mike Garcia in California's 25th district, who Katie Hill's old seat, is an example of that on some level. Just just because we are maybe days away from getting a Supreme Court ruling on DACA, what is the perspective of and I vacillate between thinking, maybe broadly speaking, the political, I guess, conventional wisdom that Latinos and Hispanics, necessarily weigh immigration issues as a primary concern is maybe, a mistake, and is maybe in and of itself a little bit, I don't want to say bigoted, but a little bit presumptuous. But something like DACA, just seems to me to be the lowest hanging fruit for, for people in terms of these were kids who were brought here and who don't, they had no, there was no volition here. There was, and they don't know, in many instances, the countries that they would be deported to. How does a Hispanic Republican look at DACA?
Man, these are really, really excellent questions, Sam. And so it really does feel like the lowest hanging fruit, doesn't it? I mean, these aren't just children who were brought without a choice in the matter. I mean, they've become high school graduates, college graduates, PhDs, business owners, service men and women, all kinds of things. So they're Americans. They've been Americans their whole lives. They don't know anything else. I would say that DACA also has widespread support nationally among Democrats and Republicans. I mean, so I can't help but understand the president's opposition to DACA now, and his own position has shifted, and his own willingness to support it or not has shifted in the past 4 years. I mean, I just can't help but think that he's seeing everything right now through a very narrow electoral lens, and also making the wrong gamble in many cases. I mean, I think a gamble to oppose DACA now is only a gamble that has to do with really motivating I hate to use the word base again, because that too is such an imprecise term, but that's the gamble he's making, I think. And, this is kind of what I was referring to when I was talking about how Hispanic Republicans over the past 25 years have been increasingly hard pressed to justify their continued support for Republican candidates. And I think it's only in the past 25 years when Hispanic Republicans have had to so vocally state that immigration is not the only issue we care about. And in surveys, it ranks maybe third, fourth, fifth behind education, behind jobs, behind healthcare. Then immigration is important. And that's always been true. I mean, Hispanics have always cared about other things besides or in addition to immigration. But I think the Hispanic Republicans have never had to state that so forcefully as they do now, right, as a justification for their continued support.
Well, it's a fascinating question, and I have a feeling that, we could talk again in another 10 or 15 years, and maybe we're at that point where, like, people wake up one day and go like, maybe it's not just Donald Trump, but it may take I don't know, may take Tom Cotton to be president before, to the extent that, there's going to be some sort of change in perspective. But
it might be, and I will say that over the past 50 years or so, ever since African Americans fled the Republican Party, Americans, Democrats in particular, have been kind of waiting for this similar moment when Latinos would finally decide that the Republican Party is not the party for them, and that they too would have the kind of mass exodus toward the Democratic Party that African Americans did in an earlier period. And it hasn't happened yet, but that is not to say that it won't happen in the future.
Geraldo Cadava, Associate Professor of History, Northwest University. The book is The Hispanic Republican, The Shaping of an American Political Identity from Nixon to Trump. Really interesting. Thank you so much for your time. We will put a link to that book at majority.fm. Thanks again.
Thanks for having me on.
All right, folks.